We're in Daniel chapter 3 this week. We're continuing our journey through the Bible chronologically in order. So this week, I'm on the live stream. I need to not move around so much. Is that right? Do I need to stay still? Okay, they can follow me. Greetings to all of you on the live stream. We're in the book of Daniel, so we will arrive in the New Testament in approximately 8 weeks or so in October. So as you read the Bible through chronologically, you see the majority of it is Old Testament. So some of you are getting familiar with those stories. And we are right in the midst of the point when the nation of Israel, the nation of Judah, the southern kingdom, the northern kingdom had already fallen, and they're being deported into Babylon. So it's a very contemporary sounding story, because of immigration as part of this story, deporting people from, in this case, from their homeland to Babylon. And so we're going to see people adapting to that in the text. In this chapter, even though it's the book of Daniel, Daniel is not present. We don't know if he's off on official business since he's now a government official. You remember he was able to successfully be appointed into a fairly high cabinet position in Babylon. So he's not in the chapter. So it does show the minority status of the Jewish people in Babylon. And a contemporary author named Philip Jenkins says this is how actually the faith spreads around the world, is primarily through immigration, less so missions, even though we participate in missions as well. But he says immigration is one of the key reasons why the Christian faith spreads around the world. And we see this in the spread of the faith here in this text. So I believe God works in immigration. God works in these kind of things. And so maybe, whether you're here, this is your home country, whether you're here, you immigrated here, God is involved in the way that people migrate around the world. And you need to see your own life and circumstance, I think, in that way. Other things we see in this chapter, before I read from it, as I want to point out, is we see music influencing people's behavior, right? The king is going to say, as soon as you hear the sound of these instruments, they're supposed to bow down and worship, and they do. And we see in the Bible that music has been used to calm down Saul when he had a manic episode. David would play and Saul would calm down. We see Elijah when he was preparing to prophesy to a king, he called for a musician to come and play, and it helped him get in the right mind to receive prophecy. And we also see this just in general in various ways. Music is used to influence people. Let me give you just a couple of ways, since I find this fascinating, and I'm up here today, so I might as well just do this. But when Manuel Noriega was the Panamanian dictator, and the United States were in conflict with him, and they decided that they wanted to remove him from office, he was in the Vatican embassy in Panama, and the U.S. military surrounded him, and they played loud, heavy metal rock music to help drive him out of the embassy. He just said, I can't take this music anymore. In Britain and Australia, they used a different tactic. When they had young people congregating in the subways and harassing people, they started piping in classical music. And the young people said, I can't take this music, and they had to leave the platform, and they went off somewhere else, and it solved that problem. And then the U.S. military, after the fall of Iraq, and they had many detainees, to help them to tell the truth, they blasted them with Metallica, alternating with Barney the Dinosaur. And those two things weakened their constitution to the point where they couldn't keep lying. They had to tell the truth. So you don't know, how people are going to respond to these things, but there does seem to be a connection between people's behavior and the music they listen to. We'll say more about that a little bit later. But let's go ahead and read the text here in Daniel chapter 3. And it says in verse 1, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits, or about 90 feet. and its breadth 6 cubits, or about 9 feet. He set it up on the plain of Dura, in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace." Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And so you see there that the majority of the people, nearly everyone, fell down and worshiped, regardless of where they were from. So they all complied, except for these people we're going to look at here in just a minute. So we're going to look at 3 points today. The first is a gold god, and these notes are in the TLC app. If you have it, you can look at the sermon notes with the outline. So the first point is a gold god. We need more than a gold-plated faith. Number 2, idol worship. We have to decide whether we will compromise or not compromise when we are pressured. And number 3, deliverance. There was another in the fire with them, and that is going to make all the difference. So the big idea today is that God's presence sustains us in the fire. God's presence sustains us in the fire. So let's look at this. Number 1, a gold-plated god. It says in verse number 1, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold. And 12 times in this chapter, the word image appears. So this is a very important concept in this chapter. And we know that the 10 Commandments prohibited creating images that we would worship in place of God. So this is a clear violation of that. And it seems to me that one of the key things here is that hubris or pride struck again in Nebuchadnezzar's life. He is prone to this quality, becoming proud and arrogant, and we'll see this throughout his story. In the previous chapter, chapter 2, at the end of the chapter, you know that Daniel, he had a dream, and Daniel interpreted the dream for him, and Nebuchadnezzar pronounced that Daniel's God was God, and that people should worship the God of Daniel. And then here we read the very next chapter, he's creating a god of gold, gold-plated god, and calling on people to worship that as God. So he's all over the place with his gods. Now, how could he do that so quickly? Well, it seems probably 15 to 20 years had transpired. Tripper Longman says, "We do not know how much time has elapsed since the previous episode, but we must imagine a gap of not a few years to account for Nebuchadnezzar's shift from honoring the God of Daniel, as he did at the end of chapter 2, to throwing that God's devotees into a burning furnace." You know, you just don't snap your fingers and change your mind that quickly, it doesn't seem. So there was a period of time in between chapter 2 and chapter 3 for Nebuchadnezzar's pride to kind of raise up again after it had been, affected by that dream. And I don't know if you're like this or not, but maybe you're humbled by life circumstances. Something happens and you're humbled by life and you rely on God. But then as things start getting back to normal again, you start getting that old feeling again, and you feel like, I'm pretty good. I know what I'm doing. I'm the man. I got it all going on. And the pride starts rising up in your soul again, and you start relying on yourself and not relying on God. And that seems to be what Nebuchadnezzar's challenge was. So he has created this 90-foot image. And Everything I read about it says that it wasn't gold solid, but it was gold plated. They didn't make fully gold images in that way. So it's an apt metaphor. A gold-plated God is an apt metaphor for who Nebuchadnezzar was. He was shiny on the outside and looked great, but inside there was not much substance. And maybe some of us, that is our, kind of how our faith is. It looks great to everyone around us, but when you really dig down and look beneath the surface, there's not much there. It made me think of this passage made me think of a principle that I concluded long ago, and that is that we should never name anything after someone until after they die. Never name anything after someone until after they die. Marcia and I, when we were in a Bible college, we had an influx of students from another Bible college because that Bible college was named after an evangelist who had had a moral failure. So they all migrated on to our Bible college, because you can't go to a place that's named after someone who's now notorious. In our town, Marcia knows I'll say this, but the middle school gymnasium is named the Augustino Rotino Gymnatorium. It's like a Latin term. I don't even know what it is, but he was the superintendent of schools and the administrator of schools at the time that all happened. I just think that's bad when the person in charge is the one that they name everything after, and it's a hard name to say, so it would have been a lot simpler to name it something different. Statues are a hot topic in our country, more so 4 or 5 years ago than right now. But people were trying to figure out, do we want to destroy this statue that represents something bad about our history, or do we leave it to help us remember what we came through? And people had different opinions. Statues were getting torn down. But there's a long history of statues being torn down, and people don't like statues that don't represent their interests. In 1776, in a park called Green Park in Manhattan, Continental soldiers joined with patriotic New Yorkers to tear down a statue of King George III of England. It was a statue with him on a horse. People said, we don't like the British, and so they tore down the statue. In Hungary, in 1956, they tore down a statue of Stalin that had been established, which was 60 foot tall, 18 meters for those of you who are metrics people. It was toppled after 7 years of being there during the Hungarian Revolution, and they chopped his head off. You can see pictures online if you look it up. They so didn't want a Stalin statue there. And you might think, well, Africa is, continent of peace, but they also do the same thing there. It's a human condition that people want to make statues to themselves. And in 1958, Kwame Nkrumah, who was the president of Ghana, had an Italian sculptor make a statue of him. It was erected, and then it was damaged in a bomb attack, and then in a coup it was destroyed, but then later on, many years later, rebuilt, and now it's displayed a little more quietly in a city in Ghana. So statues are things that people make that oftentimes are controversial and oftentimes cause problems, and they are not to be worshiped as God. And we're going to find out how this plays out here in just a minute. So the first thing we see is that a gold-plated faith, a faith veneer, won't satisfy or won't get you through when you face the kind of pressure that these three Jewish men were about to face. So let's go to point number 2, idol worship, compromise or no compromise. And it says in verse number 8, therefore at that time certain Chaldeans Babylonians came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. So they are all too ready to report on these guys. Now remember, they were all classmates together in chapter 1 of Daniel. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who had been renamed from their Jewish names, were at the top of Nebuchadnezzar's class, and so they did better than the Babylonian students in the vocational training that they had. And so they were appointed to these positions, and now they can't wait to tell what these guys are doing because they really want them to get in trouble since they had beaten them out in class. And the question then here is, would the three Jewish men, would they fall prey to the fear of man, or would they put the fear of God before the fear of man? And that's something that we all struggle with as we leave, is will we fear other people, their opinions, what they think of us, more than we fear God? And these three chose that they were going to fear God more than they fear man. We call it peer pressure in society, and it can be good or bad. They each had sort of, it seems, a pact together, so they influence each other. Their peer group, right, influence each other positively. We need those kind of things here. Christianity is a subculture of our larger culture here in America, and we need positive peer pressure, but there's a lot of negative peer pressure bearing down on us all the time. There was a lot of peer pressure for them. This was a state law, right, a government law, national law that said you must worship this image, and they refused to do it. There was a woman who was turning 100, and someone asked her, what's the best thing about turning 100? And she said, that's easy. There's no peer pressure. There's no peer pressure when you turn 100. Nobody cares. I don't care. And there's no other 100-year-olds to put pressure on me anyway. Peer pressure is the fear of man. It's fearing what people think of you. That's why people dress alike. That's why people talk alike. That's why people want to fit in. And it can become problematic. Here's what Eugene Peterson says in his paraphrase of Romans 12:2. Don't become so well-adjusted to your culture that you fit in without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God. You'll be changed from the inside out. Readily recognize what He wants from you and quickly respond to it. Unlike the culture around you, always dragging you down to its level of immaturity, God brings out the best in you, develops well-formed maturity in you. So that's how we respond to peer pressure, is by not letting the culture pressure us into its mold. It's trying to mold us and make us into the kind of people that the larger culture wants us to be. Peer pressure. It's bearing down on us all the time. And what was the response here? The response here had to be civil disobedience. This isn't the first act of civil disobedience in the Bible. The first act was the Hebrew midwives who said, we are not going to kill the babies when they're born, as we've been instructed by the Pharaoh to do. So they didn't do it. And that's how Moses was born and thrown into the Nile and raised up to lead God's people. And these three stood together against the coercion of the state, and they refused to bow down to the idol. It doesn't even seem in the larger culture this was controversial. It's just everyone did. Everyone bowed to the god of gold except the three. And then we see in here also, again, the music aspect is part of it. And you'll notice as we read through it, how many times, I think 3 or 4 times in this chapter, it mentions all the instruments that were part of playing the music that would precede the bowing down in worship. And I wonder what kind of music would it be today if we were trying to get people to influence people. And there's lots of music out there, and I love to think about this, but it was instrumental music. And as soon as they heard the sound, they knew, like Pavlov's dog, boom, they're bowing down and they're worshiping the image. Warren Wiersbe said it this way: Nebuchadnezzar was wise to use instrumental music because it could stir people's emotions and make it easy for him to manipulate them and win their submission and obedience. Throughout history, music and song have played an important role in strengthening nationalism, motivating conquest, and inspiring people to act. Music has the power to grip human thoughts and emotions that people are transformed from being free agents into becoming mere puppets. The English poet William Congreve wrote that music has charms to soothe a savage breast, but music also has power to release the savage in the breast. Music can be used as a wonderful tool and treasure from the Lord, or as a destructive weapon from Satan. And so music, depending on the music you listen to, it will influence you. It will reinforce certain patterns of thinking in you. And so be aware of that. This was influential for them. They knew when they heard it exactly what to do, and they did. And what music do you hear that it drives you a certain direction in life, to certain thought patterns, to self-destructive thought patterns? This is what was happening here. How is music influencing you? And then the other thing that we need to talk about here in this section is the immigrant issue. So again, the people of Israel were deported, physically removed, taken, and moved to Babylon. And so they had to figure out, what are they going to do now when they live there? Are we going to assimilate? Are we going to just integrate and retain our own religious practices? Or are we going to start serving the gods of the Babylonians? Are we going to keep using our own names and only use the Babylonian names they gave us in public, but at home we're going to continue to speak the Hebrew language and keep using our own names? These are the kind of things they had to decide. We saw in chapter 1 that they chose to continue to retain a kosher diet. They didn't succumb to the Babylonian diet, and they actually outperformed the other Babylonians when they did that. It was apparent. So these are all the things that people have to think about when they are forcibly or when they immigrate to another land. And you have to decide, am I going to continue my faith here, or am I now going to be free to believe whatever I want, just like the people of the land do? It's a challenge. Daniel was renamed Belteshazzar. You remember in chapter 1. They renamed the 3 other friends as well. Belteshazzar, here's what Daniel's name meant in Babylon. O lady, protect the king. That was Daniel's new name. I'm sure he wasn't thrilled to have that name. O lady, protect the king. But even though they renamed him on the outside, he didn't change on the inside. And he continued to live by his faith. And maybe you've come here, as an immigrant. I've seen many people who, for whatever reason, their native language, people can't pronounce their name, so they have to take on a new name just because people can't pronounce it. Or I remember there was one time here in this church many years ago, a woman came and she found out her name had a kind of a, it was kind of a bad word in English, part of her name. So then what do? Assimilate, I guess. But these are the kind of challenges that people face. But it can also bring out the best in people's faith. They can also rise to the occasion and trust in God more than ever because they are in a minority status. They're not in power, and so they have to rely on God. And that's what they did here. So here, the coercion of the king meets the conscience of the Hebrews. And they stand against him. And what does it do? It says in verse number 13, Nebuchadnezzar went not just into a rage, but into a furious rage. It is emphatic there. They use 2 words for rage together, which means it was a bad rage. And you see what happens to people when they don't get their way, when they're just full of themselves. They don't do what he wants, so he just he flies into a rage. And then he says to them, you're not going to serve my gods, then I'm going to send you into the fiery furnace. And that is exactly what happens, even after he tried to give them another chance, to strike up another round of music so they could bow down, and they wouldn't do it. They decided they were going to trust in God. So this was obviously a capital offense. And now the king says it's time to execute the sentence. And let's look at what happens then. It says in verse number 24. Actually, let's go up to verse 21. 20. He ordered some of his mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Now, you know what normally happens to people who are prisoners, who are being executed, is they strip them down and they parade them around to humiliate them. That's what normally would happen, especially in the ancient Near East. They strip them of their clothes, they march them around, and then they kill them to ultimately humiliate someone. But in this case, the king is so angry. What's he do? He leaves them fully dressed, bound in their cloaks and tunics, their hats and their other garments. And it's like they're going to turn them into fire matches or sticks of fire, and they throw them in. It says, because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the fiery furnace. So their loyalty to a godless leader has caused all these men who participated in throwing them in, they all died instantly because it was so hot. But what happens in verse 24? Let's look down and see what it says. Then Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselor, did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? And they answered and said to the king, true, O king. He answered and said, but I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they're not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. So it's remarkable here that these men fully dressed are thrown into the fire, and he looks in and he sees them walking around like they're fine. They're not on fire. The same fire that had killed everyone who threw him in is not able to kill the three. And it says, and besides that, I see a 4th walking around in the fire, and he looks like a son of the gods. And when you're Nebuchadnezzar and you don't believe in one God, that's about the best you can do. But we know that the 4th is like a son of God walking around in the fire. So the word bound or bind occurs a few times here. They bind them. They're bound in their cloaks. They fall bound into the fiery furnace. But what happens is almost as soon as they fall in being bound, they are seen walking around unbound. And maybe this is how your life has felt when you put your faith in Jesus. Right? You felt all bound up. You felt like you weren't free to do what you wanted to do because you were doing so many things that you couldn't stop doing because you were addicted, or you were just full of sin and you were full of shame and you just couldn't change your behavior. And then Jesus comes in and he changes things around, and once you were bound, but now you are set free. That's exactly what happens to these people in this fire. Did I not see 3 men bound, but I see 4 men unbound. 3 men going bound, 4 men walking around unbound, free. We used to sing a song, I'm so glad Jesus set me free. Satan had me bound, but Jesus set me free. That's what happened to me. I don't know what happened to all of you, but that's pretty good stuff. Isaiah tells us this, sort of prophesying about this. But now thus says the Lord in chapter 43, he who created you, O Jacob, he who formed you, O Israel, fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name, for you are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you, for I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel. So these 3 refused to worship a gold-plated God. They refused to be idolaters. And God preserved them in the fire. So I'm going to invite the worship team to make their way back. We've seen how Nebuchadnezzar created a gold-plated God. But we need more than a gold-plated faith. And maybe you're tempted by this world, the shiny things of this world, the nice things, the things that attract the world. Maybe you're attracted to those things too. And God is saying, I want to show you what's really great. I want to show you what's really powerful. Maybe you are prone to the fear of man, to compromise because you want to fit in, make people around you happy. Maybe you live differently in your workplace than you do in the holy place here. Maybe you have a whole different set of values depending on where you go and the people around you. Maybe the peer pressure gets to you. I'm going to call on you today to no longer compromise. And maybe you're in the fire right now. Maybe it's overwhelming you. Maybe your world's on fire. But let me remind you that there is another who can come into that fire and lift you out of that fire and make you whole and free. Now, as we read on the rest of the chapter, Nebuchadnezzar does another dumb thing, and that is once he sees the law here, or what God does, what the Hebrews do, he decides to make another law and says, well, now, everyone, we've got to worship Daniel's God. Would he just stop with making laws? Please. Just let us be free to worship God. That's what we like about this country. You don't have to worship our God, but you're free to worship our God. And then we know it's from your heart. You do it, you're not coerced to doing it. You're not being forced to do it. Years ago, we used to sing a hymn, God leads his dear children along, and it says, some through the waters, some through the flood, some through the fire, but all through the blood, some through great sorrow, but God gives a song in the night season and all the day long. That's how God works in us. He goes in the fire with us. And the one last thing about the fire, firefighters are trained to do what? They're trained to go to the fire, right? They go attack the fire. They go into the fire to search and rescue for people. And I can only think, as I think about history, that there must have come a point in history where God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit were looking down at the world, and they said, the world is on fire. And Jesus raised his hand and said, I'll go. He said, I'll go. I will go in the fire, and I will rescue as many as I can. And so he came from heaven to earth, went into the fire, gave his life, allowed himself to be set on fire and burned up on our behalf. That's what he did for us.